Hey, welcome back to Gold's Garage for episode 6 on the build of Paul's engine. It's ready to go in the engine stand. And since episode 5, obviously, I've done some things that I was not able to film, and I had to get it together. I got stuff coming in and stuff to go out, and so what I'm going to do for you today, because if you're a lot of folks that are making comments following this, I'm just learning how to do this, or I haven't done many builds, or I've been following it. I don't want to leave you hanging. So I think I can do a pretty good job. I took a lot of pictures when I was doing it by myself, and Mike has the pictures, so if he can insert them at the appropriate time, I'm going to lead you through the process. And I think it'll be just about as helpful as videoing, the actual action in most cases. Now, if there's something that I missed, I'm here to help you, and so send me a comment, send me a question, and I'll try to answer it. And the other thing is, a lot of things that may not have been included, I have done on previous videos. Adjusting valves, for example. There's lots of videos I've done about things like that, installing the distributor and stuff. But I'll try to go through that as much as I can for you today. And once again, if there's anything missing, let me know. So at the end of episode 5, like I said, the oil pan was on. And once the oil pan goes on and the balancer goes on, I turn the engine upright. It never gets turned again. It's staying upright till it's done. So the heads had to go on next. And I hadn't said much about them, except I did use one of the heads for the leak down, compared to the leak down before I rebuilt the short block and after. And after the video, I started taking the heads apart, and I realized they needed more work than I thought, I guess. And so I took them to Mark Atchison at Atchison Machine Shop in London. He's probably the best guy in Canada to rebuild your heads. And turned them over to Mark. We had a discussion about what to do, and he did a complete rebuild. I'm going to detail that for you. We have some pictures. We even have pictures of Mark in the pictures. So he's been doing this for a long time. And so it's a good thing I did, because he found some things that I might not even have noticed, to be honest. And so it wasn't a cheap rebuild. And if these weren't such special heads I've mentioned in the previous video, these are the 292 angle plug heads. You can see that by where the spark plugs are coming out in the picture. And they're pretty unique heads. They were basically the NASCAR heads, and in Canada, the CASCAR heads. They do not even have a heat transfer port under the intake manifold, because they were made just for racing. They were never ever installed on a car that was sold. They were over the counter from GM Performance, even back in the 70s. So they're pretty unique heads, and they will work pretty good. And as a result of that, initially my customer Paul wasn't interested in dynoing it, so I want to dyno it. So I said, Paul, I'll dyno it for free if you let me dyno it, and he's going to go along with that. So we have a dyno date of March the 1st. And so even after, I will make another video when I get it running on my test stand. We're going to take it back off, and we're going to wait till March 1st, and we're going to dyno it. Because this engine is almost identical to the last two 350s that I built. Both have about 10-to-1 compression. This has got a Comp 280H cam, and that's the cam that actually Paul installed himself sometime in the past. And when I took it apart, the camshaft was in good condition, so there was no reason to replace it. It's already been broken in, so I don't have that stress of breaking in a new camshaft. And it's a pretty good cam. They're 230 degrees intake and exhaust, I think, and 470 lift, I think, something like that, in that range. So pretty much in about the same range as the last two 350s. One was that Summit 4.7 swap cam. And about the same compression, but they both had the ProMax 175 heads, which are really good heads, and they both made over 400 horsepower. So we'll see what this one does. Someone has ported these heads. I didn't port them. They were ported when I took them off the engine. Can't comment on the quality of the porting job. I'm not an expert on it. Some of the factors, they definitely opened up the ports, that's for sure. and you can probably see from the camera the size of the exhaust ports is bigger. I had to use a 1206 Velcro gasket to cover the ports properly. So that gives you an idea. So it'll be a nice comparison to say, how do these heads, old school versus new school, how do these heads compare to the Pro Max heads? So we'll see what happens. So here's what Mark found he had to do when he got the heads. First of all, he hot tanked and pressure tested them to clean them. They were pretty grungy, and he cleaned up all the ports. There was a lot of carbon in the ports as well, and I never would have got that out with any kind of mechanism that I own. They were hot tanked once again, and he actually had to still clean the ports out. A complete valve job. The valves were actually in pretty good shape. Some of the valve seats needed work, and that's one of the reasons I took them when I did the leak down in the previous video. You can see the bubbles coming out of, I think it was number 4 or 6 cylinder anyway. If you look at the episode 5, we showed you the bubbles coming out of the valve. So we knew right then that, and I did try to lap. If you've heard about lapping valves, you take a little bit of grinding compound and clean up the surfaces, but lapping was no method to fix that. They needed to be machined. So took them to Mark, complete valve job. When he got it apart, not all the guides were bad. The ones I looked at were okay, but he found some bad valve guides, so we changed all the valve guides. The seals, it had seals on it, but because the valve springs were 2-piece springs, outer and inner spring with a damper, the inner spring was being fouled by the valve seal. So up to watch for if you're doing that. So he had to machine all the guides down for performance valve seals to make room for the inner spring to work properly. So if he hadn't done that, and it's back on the engine, I can't show you the detail of that, but if you can imagine, the inner spring had to be kind of forced over the valve seal, and so it's not going to work right like that. So he had to machine every surface, replaced all the guide plates. So here's the old guide plates. It actually had 3/8 push rods in it, and if you notice from the previous video, so someone just ground out these pushrod guide plates like this, and to make the valve make room for the 3/8 push rods, but it wasn't a machine process. They should have been replaced. So what was happening was some of the valves, because the push rods were offset, the rocker arm wasn't running on the top of the valve correctly. So we replaced them with new guide plates, and we actually put 5/16 push rods. An engine like this with 110 pound springs, 280 pounds open, does not need 3/8 push rods. So we put 5/16 push rods in it. So, and then the other thing was, we ended up resurfacing the head, and Mark pointed out to me a couple of places where it was rough around the water cooling jackets where they cooled the spark plug. And if he hadn't done that, we might have been dealing with a head gasket leak. So it wasn't cheap, but it was money well spent. And now we're set up for a challenge of old school versus new school. Now, these are probably the best GM heads ever, except for Vortex. The Vortex they came on 20 years later when the Vortex heads showed up. They definitely are the go-to heads now if you're going to rebuild a small block Chev. But anyway, it's going to be an old school deal. So back to the shop. So that took a while, and we got the heads back. Had to repaint them, of course. So the next thing I did was check the combustion chamber volume, because the heads, it looked like, had been resurfaced a little bit before. And we took 3 thou off at Atchison's to get it clean. So there's pictures in there of this process. I used my burette to check the combustion chamber volume. These heads were 66 cc's originally, and they were about 64 cc's. So based on that, the calculation of the compression ratio is about 10.1. For a cast iron head is just about right. I wouldn't want to use much more than that. It's a good number, 10, maybe 10.5 to 1. But anyway, we're happy with 10 to 1. So when I installed the heads, I used Felpro 1094, and there's a picture Michael have. These are this is the part number. These were stainless steel head gaskets. They're only 15 thousandths of an inch thick, and with those head gaskets, we were 25 to 27 thou down the hole with the pistons. We're 40 to 42 thousandths of an inch quench. So gives us our perfect quench. I did state in the previous video I was going to paint the head gaskets with this Permatex copper. I have done that before. It's basically copper, make a gasket, and it's kind of a tricky little job doing that. But when I said that, I wasn't planning to resurface the heads. So now that I've had the heads resurfaced, the block's been decked, so the block surface is perfect, the head surface is perfect. There's really no need to do this. I've used those gaskets without doing this, even on the used head, and I've never had one leak actually. But that is an extra insurance. But in this case, I didn't do that for the reason that I just mentioned. So, head bolt sealant, there's pictures, Michael put screenshots up. This is the sealant that I call goop. It's Permatex 80634. It's messy stuff, and you have to put that on the threads and under the head of the bolts, because most of the head bolts, probably all, but anyway, I do them all, but the head bolts in a small block go into water. So if you don't seal them, you're going to have water leaking into your oil, and that's not going to be good. So you got to seal them. There's a picture in there showing you how to do that, and that was done. Then for break-in, I used Lucas 30 weight break-in oil with zinc. Now there's other good break-in oils you can use. The main thing is you need zinc. Now it's not quite as critical in this case because the camshaft's already broken in, but you still need break-in oil to help your rings break in. Okay, so initially, and you got to use oil even after you break in with zinc in it. So the next step is after we will actually change this oil after I start it up. When Paul picks the engine up, it'll have the second fill, and then I'm going to set him up to use Lucas hot rod oil with zinc. There's competitors, there's lots of stuff that works. That's just what I've been using. It's readily available at my APC supplier, and so I use it, and zero issues so far with it. And the next thing I do is adjust the valves. Now, I don't have that in a video, obviously, but I have made videos of doing that. And the process that I use the firing order. You start at number 1, or wherever you start, you need to know. Let's assume you're at number 1. Firing order is 18436572, and you rotate the balancer. Is marked every 90 degrees. Every 90 degrees. So if it's 1, you turn it 90 degrees. The next one you do is 8, you turn it 90, and so on through the firing order. And I adjust the valves, put the rock arms on, and adjust the valves before I put the intake manifold on. Now, you don't have to, obviously. It's just easier. The feel you have of turning the push rod and getting the valve adjustment just right is a lot easier when you get your hand right down there on the push rods. That's how I do it. There's no manifold on it. And then I also prime the oil pump before I put the intake manifold on. And there's pictures in the screenshots of that going on. And we had 45 or 50 psi of oil pressure, even with a low speed drill. And one of the things when you do it that way, you can see the oil. When you start priming it, once the oil fills the filter, you can see the oil working its way through the valve train, coming out every valve lifter. So you know your engine is going to get oil. Now, in the past, I probably said this, and that was my practice. I would keep priming it until I had oil at every rocker arm. I don't really feel that's necessary. And if you look at old school way, Waddell Wilson's book said, put a drill bit in there and with a screwdriver blade, and if you hear it gurgling, you know you got oil pressure. Well, I have a pressure gauge. I got 40 psi of oil pressure. I've got oil coming up some rocker arms. It'll come up the rest when you get it started. I make sure the rocker arms are oiled for startup, so the adjusters and everything have oil in them. It's not a bad thing to keep priming it. You can wear out a good electric drill. In some cases, it takes a long time to get all 16. Your call. but that's the way I do it now. I'm very confident that it'll be fine. I just make sure I got oil pressure. I can see oil getting to every valve lifter. Coming up some of the push rods, we're good to go. So that's how I do it. There's, in building engines, there's probably more than one way to do almost everything, and both of them can work. So that's what I do, and you can do it whatever way you want. It works for me. So checking push rod length, there's some pictures in there. So I use my little bird's beak tool, and as you can see, the push rods are off a little bit. The 3/8 push rods that I had, unfortunately, are a little bit short. 7/780 is the standard length, and I used my adjustable push rod, and I got to show this because it's an expensive tool and it's the only use I have for it. There's a picture in there. So you adjust this push rod until you get the right rocker arm geometry, take it out of the engine, measure the length. So the length I have now is 640. So the push rods are actually a little bit, they're too long by 140 thousandths, which is quite a bit. So it's not unsafe to start the engine up. There's still pretty good contact. In fact, the contact point looks pretty good. I actually paint the top of every valve stem with just something as simple as this. You can use Daikin Blue if you want. A Sharpie works. And then after you run it a little bit, take a couple of rocker arms off and you can see where your contact pattern is. That's one way to check that. So we'll verify that, and we'll probably change all the push rods after we break it in. But I went ahead and assembled it that way. It'll run fine. There's lots of engines running around with worse numbers than that, but we will fix that in the future. Valves are adjusted, follow the timing order. Then the intake manifold, whenever you've modified, the block's been decked, the head's been decked, so there is an issue how the intake manifold is going to fit. So make sure if you're doing this, use Permatex on the China wall, just a bead of Permatex. But I put the whole manifold on before there's any Permatex. Measure that gap to see how much that gap is. Sometimes if the gap is right, you can actually use the gaskets that come with your valve cover gaskets. I have done that with success. In this case, because of those machining operations, that gap was pretty small. So that was not an option. And using a bead of Permatex is really the only way to do that. And that's what I did. But don't do that when you put the manifold on the first time. Leave that off, put the manifold on, make sure every bolt goes in and out without any issue, because you have lowered your deck a little bit, right? In this case, the ports and the heads are way bigger than the ports in the manifold, so port matching is not going to be the issue. Fitting the intake manifold bolts is. So there was only one manifold bolt that I had trouble getting in, but I took the manifold off and I took the next size drill, 64th more, and reamed out every hole in the intake manifold so that when the bolts go in, they're not stressed, they're not binding, and you can actually turn them all in with your fingers. So the manifold's on, it's torqued to spec. It's 25 foot-pounds is usually the spec on aluminum manifold, 25 to 30 foot-pounds. The manifold's on, and it's good to go. So it's ready to put on the test stand. Mounting the distributor. Okay, where does it go? So the best way to do that is bring your harmonic balancer up to number 1. Put the distributor in without the cap on it, and point it at number 1 cylinder. That's where it should be when you're all done. Point it at number 1 cylinder. Won't go down because the gear is not lined up. The slot in the drive gear that goes into your oil pump is not lined up. Just rotate the engine over, even by hand. It'll fall into place, and you're at number 1. Then, where do you adjust it? I put the timing mark at 20 degrees and line the pointer up with number 1 cylinder, and you got yourself 20 degrees of advance. And that's all it takes. That's enough to get it started, not forget it running, and make sure when we start up we have vacuum advance, because it'll actually have 40 degrees advance when it starts. So that works, and the distributor is set to go. This engine is ready to fire. So in the next video we will fire it, and then we're going to set it aside. And as usual, I always forget to say please like and subscribe. So our channel, something about YouTube, Our channel is growing nicely. We're looking at 21,000. But you have to remember, if you're looking at this video, you know, YouTube's still free, and there wouldn't be Gold's Garage or any other channels if there weren't subscribers. As subscribers tell YouTube that somebody likes their videos. Comment, share, give me your comments. I'll try to answer your questions if you have. I work pretty hard at doing that. And try to create a relationship where, you know, our purpose is to help guys. We're learning how to do this. If you're a professional engine builder, you probably can teach me lots of stuff. But if you haven't done a lot of this, hopefully some of the things I've told you are helpful. And if they are, please give me a like, send it to a friend. And the previous video number 3, for example, it started off doing okay, and someone, I get this information from YouTube. Someone sent it somewhere else. It looks like to some Facebook page or something, and it got way more views off there than it got from YouTube, and we get credit for that regardless how it gets the views. So sharing, putting it on a Facebook page, whatever else, anything you do to help me would be appreciated. And that's about all I have to tell you for now. The next time we are talking about this engine, it'll be on the test stand. We'll fire it up and let you hear how it runs. Thank you for watching Gold's Garage.